Do you remember the moment everything changed? When one decision exposed years of hidden truth, and now the tables have turned in the most shocking way possible? Because what is happening today is not just karma, it is a complete power shift that no one saw coming. And if you want the real story behind it all, hit subscribe right now, because this is where things get wild. Do you remember the moment that changed everything? Not loudly, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet decision that cut deeper than any argument ever could. A moment where priorities were revealed in a way that could never be undone. A husband choosing escape over responsibility, a romantic getaway over the reality waiting for him at home. And while the world watched it unfold, many did not realize that this single decision would become the foundation for something much bigger, something that would take years to fully reveal itself. Because at the time, it looked like just another controversial choice, another headline, another storyline. But beneath the surface, it was something far more serious. It was the beginning of a shift, a crack in a system that had already been under pressure for years. And standing at the center of that system was someone who rarely demanded attention, someone who carried more than anyone else, but asked for the least. Someone who woke up every day focused on stability, on survival, on making sure everything stayed together, even when it felt like it was falling apart. And that person was watching everything unfold, not with dramatic reactions, not with loud confrontations, but with a quiet understanding that something was not right. And that quiet understanding would eventually turn into something far more powerful, because time has a way of revealing what people try to ignore. And what once looked like patience begins to look like endurance. What once looked like acceptance begins to look like sacrifice. And what once looked like loyalty begins to look like imbalance. And for years, that imbalance continued to grow, unnoticed by the person who benefited from it the most. Because when someone is comfortable, they rarely question the system that keeps them comfortable. And that is exactly what happened. The imbalance became normal, the sacrifices became expected, and the silence became misunderstood as agreement. But silence does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means observation, sometimes it means waiting, and sometimes it means preparing for a moment when everything changes. And that moment does not always arrive with warning. Sometimes it builds slowly, piece by piece, decision by decision, until one day the person who has been carrying everything simply decides to put it down and walk away. And when that happens, the entire structure begins to collapse, because it was never as strong as it appeared. It was being held together by effort, by patience, by someone who was giving far more than they were receiving. And once that effort is gone, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And that is exactly where this story begins to take its most unexpected turn, because the person who once stood quietly in the background is no longer standing still. She is moving forward, and not just in a small way, not just in a way that can be dismissed or overlooked, but in a way that forces everyone to pay attention. Because this is not just change, this is transformation, and transformation always creates tension, especially for those who are not ready to accept it. Because when someone you once underestimated begins to rise, it challenges everything you believed about them. It forces you to question your own role in their story, and most importantly, it removes the control you thought you had. And that loss of control is where things become complicated, because not everyone responds to change with growth. Some respond with resistance, some respond with denial, and some it becomes that you are losing that control. And that is exactly what makes this moment so significant, because it is not just about what is being gained, it is about what is being lost. And sometimes what is lost is not just a relationship or a role. Sometimes it is an identity. Sometimes it is a belief system. And sometimes it is the illusion of being at the center of everything. And when that illusion is broken, it creates a reaction that is impossible to ignore. Because it is not just emotional, it is deeply personal. It is tied to pride, to perception, and to the way someone sees themselves in relation to others. And when that perception is challenged, it does not always always lead to reflection. Sometimes it leads to defensiveness. Sometimes it leads to statements that reveal more than they intend. And sometimes it leads to moments that become defining, not because they were planned, but because they expose something real and unfiltered. And those moments are the ones that people remember. Those are the moments that shape the narrative moving forward because they cannot be undone, they cannot be edited out, and they cannot be easily explained away. And as this story continues to unfold, those moments begin to stack one after another, creating a picture that becomes clearer with time, a picture of someone stepping into their own power and someone else struggling to understand how that happened and why they did not see it coming. And the truth is, they did not see it coming because they were not looking in the right direction. They were focused on maintaining what they had rather than recognizing what they were losing. And by the time they realized it, the shift had already happened, the balance had already changed, and the person they once relied on was no longer there to hold everything together. And that is where the real story begins. Because what happens next is not just about moving on, it's about redefining everything. It's about building something new from the ground up and doing it in a way that reflects a completely different set of values, a different understanding of worth, and a different approach to what a relationship should look like. And as that new reality begins to take shape, it creates a contrast that is impossible to ignore because it highlights everything that was missing before and everything that is present now. And that contrast becomes the most powerful part of the story because it does not need to be explained, it does not need to be argued, it simply exists. And anyone who sees it can understand it. And that is what makes this transformation so compelling because it is not just a personal journey, it is a visible, undeniable shift that. And just when it seems like the transformation could not get any more intense, the story pushes even further into territory that no one expected. Because this is no longer just about moving forward. It is about what happens when the past refuses to stay quiet and begins to collide with the present in a way that forces everything into the open. Because while one side is embracing a completely new life, filled with freedom, confidence, and a sense of peace that was missing for so long, the other side is becoming increasingly aware that the narrative they once controlled is slipping away. And that realization does not come gently. It comes with frustration, with confusion, and with a growing sense of urgency to regain control. But control is not something that can be reclaimed once it has been truly lost, especially when the foundation it was built on was never as strong as it appeared. And that is exactly what begins to unfold, because every attempt to reassert authority, every attempt to redefine the situation only highlights the cracks that have been there all along. And the more those cracks are exposed, the more the audience begins to see the full picture, not just isolated moments, not just individual decisions, but a pattern, a consistent dynamic that explains why this shift was not only inevitable, but necessary. And that is where the emotional weight of the story deepens, because it is no longer about a single choice or a single moment. It is about years of decisions, years of imbalance, years of one person carrying responsibilities while another person maintained the illusion of leadership. And when that illusion begins to fall apart, it does not happen quietly. It happens in a way that draws attention, in a way that invites scrutiny, and in a way that forces people to confront truths they may have ignored before. And as this scrutiny increases, the reactions become more revealing, because when someone feels their position is threatened, they often respond in ways that expose their true perspective. Statements that are meant to justify begin to sound like contradictions. Explanations that are meant to clarify begin to raise more questions, and attempts to gain sympathy begin to fall flat, because the audience is no longer seeing the situation through the same lens they once did. They are now viewing it with context, with awareness, and with a clear understanding of what has changed and why. And that shift in perception is powerful because it removes the ability to control the narrative. It takes the story out of the hands of those who once shaped it and places it firmly in the hands of those who are observing it and interpreting it based on what they see rather than what they are told. And what they see is a contrast so sharp, so undeniable, that it becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, there is growth, independence, and a sense of fulfillment that feels genuine and earned. On the other side, there is resistance, frustration, and an ongoing attempt to maintain a version of reality that no longer aligns with what is actually happening. And that contrast creates tension, not just within the story, but within the people involved, because it forces a comparison that cannot be avoided. It highlights what has been gained and what has been lost, and most importantly, it reveals what was missing all along. And that realization is not easy to accept, especially for someone who believed they were at the center of everything, because when you see someone you once underestimated thriving in a way you never expected, it challenges your entire perception of them and of yourself. It forces you to question assumptions you once held with certainty, and it introduces a level of discomfort that cannot be easily dismissed. And that discomfort often leads to reaction, not reflection, and those reactions become some of the most defining moments in the story because they reveal more than any planned statement ever could. They show how someone truly feels when they are no longer in control, when they are no longer the focus, and when they are no longer able to dictate the terms of the narrative. And as these moments continue to unfold, they begin to shape the direction of the story in a way that is both compelling and unpredictable. Because while one side continues to move forward with clarity and purpose, the other side becomes increasingly entangled in a cycle of trying to catch up, trying to respond, and trying to regain something that may no longer be possible to regain. And that is where the stakes become even higher, because this is not just about perception anymore, it is about identity. It is about how someone sees themselves in relation to the people around them, and what happens when that self-image is challenged in a way that cannot be ignored. And that challenge becomes more apparent as the reactions become more intense, because the gap between what was believed and what is actually happening continues to widen, and that gap creates a tension that is felt in every interaction, every statement, and every attempt to address the situation, because nothing exists in isolation anymore. Everything is connected. Everything is part of a larger narrative that is unfolding in real time and being observed by an audience that is fully engaged, fully aware, and fully capable of recognizing the patterns that have led to this moment. And that awareness is what makes this phase of the story so powerful, because it is not just about what is happening, it is about how it is being interpreted, how it is being understood, and how it is being remembered. Because the way a story is remembered often becomes more important than the events themselves. And in this case, the memory that is being formed is one of contrast, one of transformation, one of a complete shift in dynamics that has redefined everything. And as this new narrative solidifies, it becomes increasingly clear that there is no going back to what once was, because the foundation has changed, the roles have changed, and the expectations have changed. And once those elements shift, they cannot simply be reset, they cannot be undone, and they cannot be ignored. And that realization is what brings this part of the story to its most critical point, because it forces a decision. It forces each person involved to either adapt to the new reality or continue resisting it. And the outcome of that decision will ultimately determine what happens next. Because while one path leads to growth, acceptance, and a new sense of balance, the other path leads to continued frustration, continued conflict, and a deeper entrenchment in a narrative that no longer serves anyone. And as the story moves forward, that choice becomes more and more apparent, because the actions begin to align with one path or the other. and the consequences of those actions become impossible to ignore. And that is what keeps the tension alive, what keeps the audience engaged, and what makes this story so compelling, because it is not just about what has already happened, it is about what is still unfolding, what is still being decided, and what will ultimately define the next chapter in a story that has already proven it is capable of surprising everyone involved. And just like that, everything comes full circle. What was once overlooked is now undeniable, and what was once controlled is now completely out of reach. This is not just an ending, it is a new beginning. And if you want more stories that reveal what really happens behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe now, because you have not seen anything yet.